Hello, greetings everyone. I'm broadcasting live from Toronto, Canada. I'm teaching here this weekend, so I am slightly less organized than usual, but ready to go as soon as you guys join me. Okay, here you come. Let us turn to verses 4 and 5, possibly we'll get to 6, of the Svabodha-mañjarī, the blossoming of innate awareness, or the flowering of one's awakening. It's nice that there's different ways to translate this title. Bodha, of course, meaning both awakeness and awareness, and swa meaning one's own, my or your or someone's, one's awareness or one's awakening. So turning to verse 4, I'll just read the Sanskrit. Vīranātha says, Tasyaiva vilopaya pradishto gurubhi pura tadagama paribramsha bhayat spashti krito maya. And this means the method, the effective method or the skillful means to the dissolution of the thinking mind or conditioned mind was taught by the previous guru or the previous gurus. Due to fear that this sacred teaching will be lost, here clarified by me. So remember that in verse 3 he talked about if the ordinary sort of conditioned mind can be temporarily dissolved, then the whole sense of separation can be temporarily dissolved. Okay, so again, we're just talking about, and he'll come back to this again and again in the text, that we're not talking about anything but a temporary state, the temporary dissolution of the conditioned thinking mind in order to see clearly, what is, as opposed to seeing everything through the mind filter, through the filter of the conditioned mind. So if we can dissolve it even for just a few moments or half a minute and be with reality directly instead of through the lens of the conditioned mind, we get more and more the taste of reality as it is instead of as we think of it. Okay, so this is what he's talking about in the text. So verse 3 talked about that dissolution of the mind, that pralina, right, of the manas. And here he says that this method, the method for the dissolution of the mind, of the conditioned thinking mind, was taught by gurus of old or previous gurus. Now, there's a question here. Does he mean to use the plural respectfully? Because in Sanskrit, you can use the plural as a mark of respect when you actually mean the singular. So he might be referring to his guru or a specific guru. Remember, his guru was the goddess K, the great female guru Keyuravati. Is he talking about her, or does he mean the plural literally? Gurus of the previous time, meaning perhaps his guru and then her guru, Jnananetra. Hard to say. Now, this statement is interesting because while certainly some scriptures or texts could have been lost in the intervening time, the only scripture we have that has anything similar to the text we're looking at now is the Vijnana Tantra. So if we can't know the answer to this, but it's entirely possible that he has the Vijnana Tantra in mind when he says, that this method to the dissolution of mind was taught by the gurus of previous times. He might be thinking of the Vīranātha because, again, we have nothing that's very similar or to what he presents here in the Svabodha-mañjarī other than the Vīranātha, unless something was lost. But anyway, he goes on to say, due to fear that this sacred teaching, this agama, could be lost, it is here spashtikrita, it is here clarified by me. I'm going to give further teachings on this sacred agama, this traditional teaching. In other words, perhaps in his time, the year 850, the Vīranātha Tantra was not well known yet. That seems quite likely because it was a relatively new text at that time. And he wants to promote it by giving further teachings on the same topic. And that topic is a kind of daily life practice in which any kind of experience can be a vehicle for realizing one's true nature. And we'll come to, specific examples of that as we go along. So this verse, is just him explaining why he wrote this text. And I can, I'll put it in your little chat window there. Okay, and then we move on to verse 5. So let me pull up the Sanskrit. Jatyadi kalpana rupa vyavaharo manastitaha vastuto natuta santi nishchityai tachamam vrajet. So that means, and I'll put this in your window too. This is not necessarily the final translation, by the way. He says, everyday behavior, vyavahara, is formed by mental constructs, vikalpas, or kalpanas, same thing, such as the supposedly universal categories like jati, like caste, and so on. And so this everyday behavior is mostly based on the conditioned mind. But these categories, like caste, etc., do not actually exist in reality. By realizing this, the yogi or yogini will attain tranquility, okay, where shama is more or less equal to nirodha. I'll come back to that. So this is an astonishing verse, you guys. It's the year 850. There is no earlier verse that I know of. Well, Paushkara Parameshwara, maybe. But there's virtually no precedent for this statement he makes, this stunning statement, which can only be the result of quite a profound awakening out of his own cultural conditioning. When he says at a time that nobody questioned the caste system, he says these categories don't actually exist except in the mind. So people at that time, you have to realize, believed that caste was genetic, that like people in Europe also believe, like the expression blue blood, that aristocrats actually have different and better blood. As it turned out, that was more opposite the case because of inbreeding. But you see, people actually did think that there were different sort of racial strains of human beings, and they thought that in different parts of the world, and especially India. So for him to realize that caste is a cultural construct is quite amazing. And this particular teaching was a strong one within the Mahārtha, the lineage of the great truth, that caste and gender divisions are largely or entirely mental constructs. And that's why if you belonged to a kula, a community of this particular lineage, within the community, there could be no acknowledgement of caste divisions or any other division. And indeed, it's recorded that people were asked to leave the community if they so much as mentioned in a disparaging way the former caste of a fellow initiate. So that's pretty hardcore. But he goes deeper than that. He's not just pointing out that caste is a cultural construct. He's saying that whatever supposedly universal category we come up with, it is a mental construct. Now, it might be a useful mental construct, right? And this goes down to fundamental things like gender. You know, only recently in the West have we come up with the idea that gender is largely a cultural construct, or entirely, according to some people's arguments. So what he's saying here is that our behavior in everyday life is very much based on these mental constructs, these created ideas. And I really appreciate the work of Yuval Noah Harari, who, if you've read Sapiens and/or Homo Deus, really gets into the significance of collective mental constructs, right? Intersubjective fictions. And if you've read Sapiens, please read Homo Deus, because he gets into it more there. And, you know, describing the implications of the fact that something like a corporation is a collective fiction, or that money is a collective fiction, and so on and so forth. So if enough people agree on something, then it appears like an inviolable reality. When it's still just a mental construct, it's just achieved the status of an intersubjective mental construct, meaning that a bunch of people, or the majority of people in a given society, share. So when the majority, in this case in medieval India, you know, basically almost everyone agreed on the caste system, so that nobody had the capacity really to question it, because it presented to them like an inviolable reality. But awakening, very much, you know, it's true both in the Western tradition, beginning with Socrates, and in the Eastern tradition, beginning with people like the Buddha and Mahavira and the early yogis of the Shramana movement and the early Upanishad writers. In both East and West traditions, we find questioning and waking up out of our cultural conditioning to be an intrinsic part of the spiritual awakening process, okay? So if there hasn't been a waking up out of your cultural programming, then it's not really awakening per se. What it is just switching from one program to another, from one, you know, cultural program you have earlier to a new spiritual one, right? So if you subscribe to a new belief system and it happens to be called a spiritual belief system, that's not necessarily awakening, right? Because that's just changing your belief system. Whereas awakening is the capacity to see what is a belief system, what is a mental construct, what is an intersubjective fiction, and so on and so forth. So, so again, the text is about the mana vilaya, or manovilaya, which is the dissolution of the mind. Okay, also known as nirodha, where nirodha doesn't really mean so much cessation. It means coming to stillness. Just like shama, he uses these terms interchangeably, shama, nirodha, that the mind subsiding into perfect stillness, so that then we can have an experience which is not mediated by the conditioned mind, okay? So what his implication is here is that through dissolving, at least temporarily dissolving the mind as you know it, then you can have this clarity and tranquility that would allow you to see for yourself clearly what is a mental construct and what isn't. see clearly that, caste, obviously in our society, we might put in race. Race is a largely, if not entirely, a mental construct, distinguishing race from ethnicity, of course. And notice he says, etc. He uses a Sanskrit word that means etc., means he wants you to consider what else. He just mentions caste as the most obvious example in his paradigm for a cultural construct that is seen as reality until the conditioned mind dissolves. And then you're seeing in stark clarity and simplicity. Now, some people might protest this teaching and say, and indeed some philosophers and scientists do say, it's impossible to have an experience that is unmediated by the conditioned mind, the culturally programmed mind. But actually there's increasing evidence from cognitive science that it is possible, and it's even possible to some extent mechanically. And so there's this, I forget what it's called, but it's something discussed in Harari's Homo Deus that's been developed by the military, frighteningly enough, but it's been developed by the military neuroscientists and cognitive scientists, and it's a device you can put on your head that sets up a particular interference wave pattern and causes the conditioned thinking mind to sort of go shama, go to stillness, just collapse into stillness. And so like this woman has these articles about it. I will look them up and post them for you, because she did this experiment. She was a journalist, and they she was in a shooting range, and they put the thing on her, and the experience she describes of total clarity, of total inner silence, of total ability to do exactly what was needed or called for in that moment is quite extraordinary. For her, it was extraordinary because she'd never felt anything like it. Now, for meditators, it's going to ring a bell. And of course, this is a completely different context. This is a device created by the military that you put on your head that makes your mind shut up for a few minutes, really becomes still. And so, but the fact is, that's also important, by the way. Context determines how the experience fits into a larger scheme of things once you come out of that experience, And so, at any rate, that same sort of clarity of awareness and presence that's familiar to meditators was totally shocking to her, and she wrote this interesting article about it that I'll have to look up and get you the reference. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is there's scientific as well as meditative evidence that says, no, this state, this mano vilaya, this shama, this nirodha, this dissolution of the conditioned thinking mind is actually possible by one means or another. Now, if you're doing it mechanically, that means, of course, you become dependent on that. So we don't really want that device to get out into the general public necessarily, because then people don't develop their own internal ability to access that state. Okay, so what's the last thing he says in the verse? He says, Nishchityai tatchamam vrajet. Okay, by realizing this, the practitioner will attain tranquility. So notice he's saying there has to actually be a realization. It's not enough that the mind goes quiet. It's not enough that clarity dawns. Then you have to dwell in that clarity enough for a realization to take root, a discernment. So this word that he's using, right, nishchiti, it's related to nishchaya. It has to do with the ability to ascertain something. And we're not talking about a thought per se, right? Just like if there are 4 or 5 objects, 3 or 4 or 5 objects on the table, You can look and see how many there are without actually having to count. If there's only 4 things, you don't need to go 1, 2, 3, 4. You can look, and in a moment, you just see that there are 4, that the collection of objects has a 4-ness quality to it, right? And some people's brains, some savants can, by the way, do this with any number. Like this was well documented. I don't remember if it was Oliver Sacks or somebody else who, there were these savants who you would throw down pickup sticks, and however many there were, they would immediately say, 246. And you ask, well, how do you know there's 246? And they count, and of course, they're always right. Well, and they said, what do you mean? It has 246-ness to it, that collection of objects. So they weren't even good at math, these savants. They could just see that the collection of objects had that nature, had that quality. So anyway, I give this as an example. This is called subbatism, which is the ability to discern something without having to sort of think about it or conceptually process it. So this is kind of what we're talking about here, that the realization, that just the clear seeing that, oh my gosh, this is a mental construct. Oh my gosh, my story is just a story. It's an interpretation. And it's not the truth. It's just one way of framing events, right? And the events themselves do not compel that particular interpretation. It's one of several, or indeed perhaps many possible interpretations, right? So this ability in everyday life is absolutely crucial. If you can't see that your interpretation is just one possible way of framing the events, and many other ways are possible and might even have as much or more validity. Well, validity isn't even the right word. Utility is the right word. Which interpretation has the most utility? Which interpretation of events gives us the most leverage, allows us to take the most effective, compassionate, beneficial action? That's the only question that matters. Which interpretation is most effective? Because none of them are true, in that even the best interpretation can only be a fragment of truth, right? Because the nature of events is that everything is connected to everything else. So everything, if you delve into it enough, is sort of infinitely complex. That's why the tradition says, and I say, the real cause of anything that happens is everything else that has ever happened. And that gets complicated, right? So then you're telling a partially fictional story about the events. And so then the question becomes, why are you telling that story? What leverage does it give you? Does it give you no leverage? Are you telling a story that causes you suffering? If so, why? If you look and see, it'll probably have to do with some skadas, or impressions of unresolved past experiences that are hanging out in your psyche and your energy body, that compel you to tell a story that actually causes you more suffering. But if you realize the story's not true, that it's just an interpretive frame, then you start to see the possibility of placing different interpretive frames that have greater utility. And at first that seems artificial. They don't seem true because your samskaras predispose you to believe that the negative story, if we can call it that, is more likely to be true. But that's not actually the case. It just feels true because of those samskaras. And if they go back to childhood, then it's going to take a while to rewire your brain to realize that the negative story is not the truer one, right? And that if truth actually has to do with utility, right? Because again, anything conceptually framed can't be said to be true in and of itself, because partially because it's so utterly fragmentary, and the truth is always way, 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 way more subtle and complicated and nuanced. Then you have to ask about utility, because that becomes your measure of truth. Okay, so that's it for this week, verses 4 and 5, and next week we continue with verses 6 and 7, and we're just now getting into the philosophical bit of the text, And after the philosophical bit, which is short, don't worry, it ends on verse 11. Then we get into the actual dharanas, or practices, everyday life centering techniques. And I think you'll be pleased and delighted to see how practical they really are and how they can fit into daily life so easily. So we just have, half a dozen verses of philosophy before we get to those dharanas. So please do stick with it and keep coming back, because I want you guys to learn these practices. And I want to give a shout out to all the patrons on the Patreon page, 117 patrons whose support is making possible this free content every week. And we might even go to more free content. But I'm so excited to share this stuff with a wider audience. And so thanks to the patrons for making that possible. And feel free to jump on there if you like, because we're like 85% of the way to our goal for the Patreon page, and you could help us reach our goal. So thank you so much, everyone. Nice to be with you. And I'll address any questions in the comments section when the video posts in just a few minutes. Take care.